Welcome to Iron Sights. This podcast candidly seeks to create opportunities and deliver impact by sharing the experiences and wisdom of successful entrepreneurs and thought leaders who unapologetically aim to win in health, fitness, business, and life. I'm your host, Scott Howell. Welcome to Old School Meets New School. Tradition meets innovation, and imperfection meets excellence. Thanks for listening and enjoy the show.
Yeah, I mean, on another very personal note, so I won Top Shot in June of 2012. And so for the first 6 months, I was having a blast, right? Like, free guns, free ammo, getting flown all across the country, autograph signings. I'm like, oh, it's like 5 minutes of fame, right?
Living your best life.
Yeah, well, December 14th, 2012 comes around, and that date is important for me for two reasons. The first is that it's my birthday. The second is that it was the date of the Sandy Hook shooting. Right. And, here I am in San Francisco celebrating my birthday with, 15 friends. And, it was a really dark day. And, I remember being in this restaurant and, we were in the private room. We had a whole suckling pig coming, and, the executive chef was someone who I had admired, and I had asked, hey, if the chef is in, if you could come by and say hi, that'd be amazing. And boy, I could feel how angry and upset he was at me. Right? The fact that
because of your association.
Because of my association with firearms. And I was like, I don't understand what's happening right now. Where how come this chef is mad at me for being a gun owner, and I am disgusted just like everybody else about what just happened today, right? And so and then I remember distinctly thinking, well, okay, wow, I think we're now going to start seeing people coming who want to come after all of our guns, specifically, my AR-15s and everyone else's AR-15s. And so I think the other fascinating dynamic is how, right, sometimes we can have the same event happen in our lives, yet have very polarized reactions to it, right? So Sandy Hook for me was the moment that turned me into a Second Amendment advocate, because I understood very clearly in that moment that if I don't speak up for my own rights and everybody else's Second Amendment rights, we are going to get run over.
Somebody's coming for them.
We're literally, and hearing a lot of these anti-gun advocates saying nobody wants to take your guns, you're no one. It's no, absolutely false.
Here we are.
Dianne Feinstein, Michael Bloomberg, the list goes on and on. Beto O'Rourke. I'm going to take all your AR-15s. I don't need to. The quotes are all out there. The video footage is out there.
We've arrived.
But now, I want to be sympathetic and understanding. Back to the point of rights.
Likewise.
If you saw Sandy Hook and you're not a gun owner, or if you're anti-gun, that's only going to reinforce, either create a new negative stereotype or reinforce existing negative stereotypes about firearms. And then your opinions about the inanimate objects, I think it's understandable, at least I can understand how then you would ascribe those negative associations to the people.
To the person, yeah.
Yeah. But there's this false connection of someone who either owns guns or supports guns is somehow violent or condones violence. That's the link that is totally false, and that needs to be challenged and debunked.
We have a long history of humans of being very terrible with that very concept, right? You've got this, we just go back to so many instances. Go back to the world history, and if you came from this region of the world and there was war and there were governments there that were oppressive, and this country went into this country and defeated that, then if you were from that country that had an oppressive government, now you're labeled as the enemy, as that person. We still do that today, every day. And again, the United States has a terrible history of this, right? Now, it's not to say that we haven't gotten better and tried to right those things, but to your point, if you're labeling people like that, labeling the person to the inanimate object or the thing, whatever that is, the entity, the religion, the whatever, the fanatic in this particular area. And all of a sudden you're associating with that. You can't just write policy and undo all of that. Mm-hmm. And I'm gonna be really blunt here particularly in the United States. Unfortunately, and this is world, it's not just the U.S., it's a lot of other places. We've shit the bed in terms of policies that we've written and how we've treated people, how we've alienated certain cultures, how we've discriminated against certain people, humans, things based on things that, again, I'd like to think as humans, giving people the benefit of the doubt, we do realize at some level we're wrong, and we've tried to undo that. But the fact of the matter is it did get done, and it doesn't just go away because you've changed the policy. And you're making these connections here. I think this is probably a good time to actually maybe bring up the point we did talk about, that you going to the Senate and bringing some things together in terms of, once you start down this path of now you're associating this thing with this person, then that discrimination begins to happen. And you've already touched on it, from the LGBT community perspective, but it goes deeper than that, right? Particularly in the world of firearms, in how these laws, how these policies that have specifically discriminated against certain cultures and certain citizens or immigrants of the United States have, in a sense, discriminated them from owning firearms or putting them in a position to even have a voice about whether they should or they shouldn't. And I wondered if we could maybe talk a little bit about that, because you kind of opened the door here, specifically about that testimony to the U.S. Senate with regard to gun control. And there were two very, very specific things that you brought up there, and I'm very interested in maybe hearing a little bit more about this. One was specifically with the Japanese internment camps that happened near and around World War II. And the other was the Chinese Exclusion Act, which happened much, much before that, right? So and by the way, in my research, in my knowledge, and I'd like to think that I may have done a little bit deeper research in all of this before ever coming to this conversation or ever getting into a conversation about these topics, that I've looked into some things and I've tried to educate myself. I've tried to take personal responsibility for putting myself in a position to at least have an intelligent conversation and not wipe the sake, or not stop the conversation with some absolute statement like you kind of described before. But there are things that go back a long time before what you even brought up, and how those things have impacted and have long-lasting implications specific to the Asian community. I want to stay there, but I think you draw parallels between the Black community, right? I think that's important. I think it's important to talk about, and how that's impacted things now, and what's going on in the Asian community specific to their Second Amendment rights and firearms. So I know that was a lot that I just threw at you there, but maybe we could just start with the testimony and what that was all about. Yeah.
So I was invited, to testify in the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee, and this was the opening salvo for many gun control measures that were, put in front of the Senate. And I've spoken out against gun control for the past 10 years. And, for me, I was trying to think, how can I make this personally, compelling, and make the argument that gun control is discriminatory and has a history of discriminating against people in our country who could have benefited, from exercising their Second Amendment rights. So, talking about the African-American community, from the inception of our country, slaves did not have rights. And then even when they started to have rights, they were 3/5 of a person. Right. And it's been this constant, multi-century struggle, right, for the Black community to get on par, right, with
be treated equally.
Be treated equally. And, the Asian American community, we've suffered similar injustices. And I think the difference, between, I would say, the Black community and the Asian community is that the Asian community, we are terrible at speaking out against,
as we were bringing up before,
injustices against our community. We just suck it up and deal with it. So the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, it was, basically this terrible, moment in our country's history, which basically subjugated the Chinese to white people, right? Where there was, California law, like this kind of like blew my mind.
This blew my mind too.
Yeah, right. Yeah. There are certain California laws on the books where, not just Chinese people, like back to, earlier we were saying, Asian is not like a monolithic thing.
Right. Where are you from?
Right. But there's this sort of dynamic of, it's like hard to tell, like, Chinese versus a Vietnamese versus Korean. So, this law was, there's like these laws in the books where I think there's like a curfew law, right? It's like if a Chinese person was like out on the streets of San Francisco, like past a certain time, that unless they had a white person vouch for them, then this a Chinese person could be at risk of being fined or jailed. So that was.
Well, there's a long list, Chris, which I'm sure you're aware of. There's a long list of crazy business.
Yeah, it's a long laundry list, and like I didn't even begin to start learning some of this until earlier this year when the dramatic spike in hate crimes against Asian Americans was really squarely in focus in our country.
It's arrived. Like we can't. This is not just a thing. Like this is not just social media, pushing this. This is happening. And don't be ignorant, right?
So the ignorant point is a great one to make, but it also started to make me think like, I'm a product of the public school education system here, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, I did not learn any of this in school.
Neither did I.
Right?
I was blown away. I started to learn about it too. I'm blown away.
Yeah, it's like so it comes back to, if someone and like me and other Asian Americans or non-Asian Americans, right, who want to, highlight actual history and make sure we're comprehensive in understanding like all the different struggles and high points and low points in our history, we need to speak up and demand that certain parts of the educational curriculum include, right, certain things. Like I'm not saying like we need to have like, a whole course on like Asian American history kind of thing, but it's like I don't really remember learning much about. I mean,
this is U.S. history, man.
Yeah,
this is U.S. history.
I think Asian American history for me, like all I remember was a little bit about the Chinese Exclusion Act, and it was like one of these typical test things, like what year was it?
Right.
1882. Okay, great.
There's no value.
I got the answer right. Maybe I'll get a 5 on my AP test kind of thing. And World War II.
There was the talk about the gold rush here in California and where
the Chinese built the railroads.
Exactly. Yeah. Where it was all centered around labor, mm-hmm. which effectively, in the end, is slave labor. When you start to break it down, you start to look at kind of how these things were handled. Now, that could be a controversial statement. I don't really fucking care, but it is what it is. That's what was happening.
You said the F word.
Yeah, I know. I love that word. Actually, I say it a lot. I mean, it's a couple of things. Like going back to your you brought this up about having to be vouched for by a white person. Here's a couple other ones that I recently became aware of. 1921, there was legislation directed at not allowing Chinese women to marry American citizens. Like, so if you were here and you got here, which is a whole other thing, you could not marry an American citizen. In 1924, this is not too far later, they went one step further, they meaning legislators, and they forbade Chinese women from entering the country with their husbands and their children. So it was okay for their husbands to come over and labor, with whatever, whether it's building railroads or in industry, but they weren't allowed to come. The women weren't allowed to come. Then in 1932, this is only a few years later, we're still turning the screws on this whole thing. And the Cable Act of 1932 stated that American-born Asians that married foreign-born Asians would lose their citizenship. So if you were born here as an Asian American, right, but then you married someone that had immigrated here from Asia, you would lose your citizenship as a female. And you could regain your citizenship, but you'd have to go through the naturalization process.
Wow.
As if you are now not an American citizen because you've married an immigrant who's not an American citizen. You've just lost your Americanism, if you will. It's gone. It's a wild, mind-blowing shit. And by the way, 1930s wasn't that long ago. I mean, the list goes on. But
yeah, when I mentioned earlier that my husband and I, we bought a property in Santa Cruz, and as we were going through the whole escrow process, and I'm looking through the deed, and all the history of it, there is, and this is something that I've learned over the past few months, there is a lot of racism in the real estate kind of laws in our country. So in the deed to our property, there's a specific provision that says this property cannot be sold to any Negro or anyone.
Literally, that's the words.
Negro, right? They say
I'm laughing. It's disgusting, but it's mind blowing, man.
It's like this property cannot be sold to any Negro or anyone of the Asiatic or Mongoloid race. And I was just like, I don't understand. Like, and this is from back on like 1950 or whatever. But I'm just like,
nobody's bothered to go back and change this and all the transactions.
This is a whole nother thing. So we'll get into that really in a second. So, I flagged this for my real estate broker. I'm like, hey Gloria, like, this is what am I reading right now? And thankfully they're just like, yeah, there's a national law that got passed in like 1960s, whatever. And like, yeah. It's like all this local racist language in real estate deeds. It's unenforceable. It's invalid.
But it's still there nonetheless.
It's still there. So yeah, the sub story here is it is incredibly hard to update, to undo or erase past things that are in real estate deeds.
Crazy.
So yeah, I mean,
so you make this policy and you go, okay, well, we'll undo that policy, but you really haven't because it's still there. Now, maybe you're not enforcing that policy, but it's still there.
And it's interesting because I subscribe to the attitude that we shouldn't be erasing history, right? So on some level, it's like no, we shouldn't like burn the books. We sometimes, and I think most times, need to face the ugliness of the past, present, and the future.
That's what you're saying about the history books. Like, I'm not saying we burn the history books, but I was never taught this. It was never even acknowledged.
Mm-hmm.
This stuff was never acknowledged. Like, erasing and acknowledging are two very different things, obviously. And acknowledging and saying we shouldn't let this happen again, right? And we need to do a better job of recognizing that it did happen, and we need to think forward on how we prevent this from happening and be aware of how the fact that it did happen. And while it has been done, we're trying to make it better, doesn't mean it's completely fixed.
Yeah, I mean, but this is also how history repeats itself, right? If
it does repeat itself.
Yeah, and so the example to provide, so part of my Senate testimony was talking about 120,000 innocent Japanese Americans who were thrown into internment camps in World War II, were stripped of all of their civil rights as American citizens. And I'm half Japanese, so I'm half Chinese and half Japanese.
There's the answer.
Yeah. and probably don't have time to get into this today, but I'm part Cuban. The Japanese side of my family is from Cuba. My Japanese ancestors were put into Cuban internment camps at the behest of the American government. And that's another, I think, lesser known story, is that the American government was encouraging other countries to intern their own Japanese because, right, this whole hysteria, right, that just because you are ethnically Japanese, that somehow you were you pledged your allegiance to Japan. I mean, this is absolutely crazy. And so, in my Senate testimony, I talked about how gun control has been used to discriminate against innocent people. And, if we then fast forward to 9/11, when 9/11 happened, my first reaction was, oh my God, there are people who are going to start going after Muslim Americans.
Mm-hmm. This was back to the point of the Sandy Hook, the restaurant, the chef, right?
And are we really going to start sacrificing our civil rights and our civil liberties and our Fourth Amendment rights against having the government, monitoring innocent American citizens under the guise of
public national safety,
national security, and public safety? And it's like right. It's sort of like this whole conversation all over again. But back to the Japanese internment camps, December 7th, was the day of Pearl Harbor. We just celebrated the 80th anniversary of the Pearl Harbor attacks, and to be frank, like there was a part of me was like, oh man, I know there's a lot of Americans who still think that like the Japanese are the enemy. I mean, I understand like how you would have maybe that mentality, but it's like, I really do not want to hear any of this on like December 7th. Like, cause it's for me, like I'm a respectful person who honors the solemnness of what happened. And it's for me, it's about honoring those who made sacrifices to protect our country. And yeah, I'm an Asian American. And I think there's this weird kind of thing with words that we do. It's like, well, I'm Asian American, but I'm American first. Mm-hmm. But we always put like the racial
other
it's like I'm African American or Latino American or Mexican American or Chinese American, but it's almost like, should we like reverse that? Because for me, I'm American first, but again, now it's like, well, I'm these other things too. But it's I think sometimes it can be very uneasy to be a minority in general, and this is in any country, but I think, even, here in the United States, it's like, well, and this just goes back to, hey, if I want to live in a free country where I'm not afraid and I don't want other people to be afraid, then I have to not just have, I need to speak up, and then my actions need to follow my words. It's just as simple as that for me.
So you've got again, going back to this testimony that you're giving, you're talking about these two very specific things, again, going back to the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Japanese internment camps, and the discriminatory impacts that has. Not only are you talking about in general a culture that is and has been rather quiet, right, about the injustices or maybe the things that are happening around them, just do the work, right? Just don't pay attention to that over there. We have things to do, to further silencing that, right? In an attempt to, under the guise of national security, these people are potentially dangerous to us because.
Yeah, right. And so back to the context of gun control and how discriminatory it is against law-abiding and responsible gun owners, right? So this is the connective thread, right? That our government has this constant notion that if we ban a thing,
it makes things
or
better.
if we control some group of people, that we're somehow going to make the country safer.
I mean, what's the historical result of that? It's the opposite, actually.
It's the opposite. Yeah. It's the thing that is the forbidden fruit is the thing that everybody wants. Right. We've seen, in the gun community, right? We often joke that the anti-gun groups are the best sales.
Yeah, absolutely. They get salesperson of the year for 2020 and 2021.
It's absolutely crazy.
You're in the gun business right now. You are fat and happy.
Yeah. Every time an anti-gun politician opens their mouth, like gun sales and ammunition sales just like go through the roof. And, we can look at prohibition, right? Back in the 1920s, right. It's literally the exact same thing. It's like, look, if you can easily make the thing at home, you can't ban it.
Where there's a will, there's a way.
It's like drugs too, right? The war on drugs. We've banned drugs. It's
throw
like,
more money at it. That'll fix the program.
Right,
more legislation. That'll fix the problem.
Yeah. Like where have we gotten over the 40 some years of the quote war on drugs? Like I get it. Like, drugs are terrible. Like some drugs are terrible. Like meth is like, just like wrecking our country, but like to ban it, it's like, it's sort of back to this, like the taboo of being afraid of talking about drugs or talking about mental health. People do drugs, right, for so many reasons, like self-medication reasons or self-hating or just escapism. But if we really want to help, drug addicts and help people get off of drugs, well, we need to help make them, we shouldn't be criminalizing the usage.
Yeah, they're not exactly. I mean, there's things that come along with that usage. Often you're buying it from somewhere, right? Well, chase the money. Go after the money. Where's the problem, right? Like, why are they doing this on the drug side of things? But yeah, you're criminalizing the person that has an issue, right? Like, how's that working for us? Well, we filled up our prisons with a bunch of people that had issues, that had drug addiction. How did that hurt or stop the drug trade or the drug industry? All they did was they just got more innovative, right? And continue to make more money.
Yeah. So, this notion of, legislators passing laws to ban things like, I think it was was it Bloomberg when he was mayor of New York City that had the soda ban, right? You can't buy sodas in larger quantities, like, 128, ounce big gulps were like banned. It's like, what happens that people are just going to buy 264 ounces for the soda. It's like, banning smoking, banning all these things. Like, one thing that I've come to really appreciate in our country is, we have a history of pushing back against tyrannical rule, right? This notion that the government or some elected official or body like trying to tell us what to do is something that's how our country was founded.
That's how we started, man.
That's how this country was founded. And that's a very unique dynamic about the United States, and whether we're whether we're talking about the COVID mask mandates and vaccinations or firearms or alcohol or all these things, it's back to guns, right? Everybody I think often loves to point to other countries and their quote unquote successes, banning guns.
Yep.
And it's like, look, everybody. The reality is we have 340 million people in this country and an estimated, almost 300 million. I think upwards of almost 400 million guns. They're not going anywhere.
They're not going away.
They're not going anywhere.
That ship has sailed.
Yeah. So this whole conversation about banning anything it's a fruitless exercise.
It's a circular conversation. Yeah.
Primarily because back to the main point of firearms are not complicated pieces of plastic and metal. There has been a long-standing American tradition of making fire homes in your home.
Right.
Like you can literally go to Home Depot right now. Recoil actually has great, basically the home gun guide. Like you just literally go to Home Depot and you can make firearms.
But what about the arguments? Well, that's the problem, Chris. That's the problem. People are now making these guns at home and they can just go out and do it. That's why we need to ban them.
Well, yeah, right. So if you then look at 3D printing technology, right? So, 6 years ago when 3D printers were starting to become a little more popular, I mean, now I have a lot of friends who started, experiment with, making polymer, frames and pistols. And there's some scary stuff
Thanks. Not for me.
Yeah, it's like, I don't want to be pulling the trigger on some questionable plastic gun kind of thing. But over the past 6 years, the technology's gotten so much better.
Like it always does.
Yeah. And, it's this question of, if you think about the Second Amendment and also just, in general with all of our amendments, and there's always this question of what was the intent of the founding fathers when they wrote the Bill of Rights? Mm-hmm. Now, kind of back to the attitude and the approach that I try and consistently take with civil rights and our Bill of Rights is where, with the First Amendment, for example, right, for free speech, the founders did not have the internet
as much
and mobile devices in mind, right? And it's just the musket of 1776 was the weapon sort of choice back then.
That was the technology.
Yeah. And it's semi-automatic, and fully automatic weapons didn't exist. So it's well, look, the AR-15 is the modern musket.
Sure.
And our civil rights mature, right, as society and our technologies progress over time. And right back to the Fourth Amendment conversation that we're having about illegal search and seizure, that was not really initially intended for digital surveillance, but of course, it's
got to evolve.
It's got to evolve. And so, where is the line that we need to draw between preserving our freedom and our civil liberties? And yes, balancing that with with public safety, individual safety, and this is going to be it'll be
an ongoing conversation,
and that's the way it's supposed to be, right?
That's what it's supposed to be,
right? An
ongoing conversation.
Yeah, our Constitution is a living, breathing document that is always going to be up for debate. And back to the silence is compliance. Like that was kind of one other thrust of my U.S. Senate testimony is, look, like if you don't speak up about this as a gun owner, then you are complicit and you are compliant with all of these gun control measures that are going to come and just, step on. It's the knee on your neck. It's the jackbooted thugs of the government who are going to come and take your guns, because that has been the stated goal for many of the top anti-gun advocates out there.
This isn't happening in the dark at night when everybody's sleeping. This is happening right there in front of your face, and they're very confident in talking about it. So it's right out there, and all the things that have happened in this last year. And you can be angry about it. Go ahead, be angry about it. But what are you doing? What are you doing that's practical, right? And what are you doing to help? And at the same time, if you don't know how to do that, then maybe search for somebody or a community that can help you maybe articulate that a little bit better. You don't, and at the same time, you don't feel like you have to take on the world by yourself. And that brings us back to the NFT and, kind of in your, I'm going to say a crusade, right? Along the way here of building community, right? A building community around the ongoing conversation to where we can get people in the room of differing backgrounds, different beliefs, different levels of awareness, knowledge, their own stories, right? Their own feelings, right? When we start to bring that stuff in, and they can have the ongoing conversation and know that they're going to disagree at the end of the day on some things, but come to some level of agreement on how to continue to have the conversation going forward, being the first step, and not making these absolute statements about, well, we have to ban this, or we have to take this away, or no, you can't do anything about this because this is my right and this is what the Second Amendment says. Again, being a living, breathing document and always up for debate. I'm not saying that it says anything other than it says. I'm just saying, like, hey, we have to recognize these things and that people are going to have differing opinions. And we need the right kind of people having those conversations or representing. And if you're not that right kind of person, then maybe search out some people that you can align yourself with that are in a healthy way. And, things have changed. Things have evolved. And I'm going to bring this one up. Like the NRA used to be a very bipartisan, organization that represented all walks of life on all sides and all different interests and tried to bring things together. And it was very much about educating people on safety, right? And on proper handling and where this fits in, where all this fits in. And now there's a lot of people, that doesn't what they're saying and what's going on through the NRA doesn't necessarily represent what I'm thinking. So, and those right now have been the voice. That entity has the money. They do have the politicians' ears, and if they're not giving the message that you want them to give, then you have to stand up. You have to make some kind of a statement. You have to figure out a way to collectively get together, and this starts inside the gun community. Stop talking shit about your fellow gun owners, like, and all the things that they're doing wrong. Come together. Like we all have our own ways of approaching things. We all have our own feelings about things, our own beliefs. We all came from different backgrounds and how we got here. Just because I didn't serve in the military doesn't mean I don't have something to say about my Second Amendment right, or that I can't handle this conversation in this way. You don't get, because you're other, right? You don't get more weight in this conversation than say somebody over here on this side does because of your background. Unless you can represent me in a way where I'm giving you that weight, I'm giving you that agency to do so. So again, coming all the way back, and this is, just kind of circling all the way back around to the NFT, the artwork, right? Your history, the work that you're doing inside the community and at large, right? To bring more of an awareness in this education. Where can the NFT fit into bringing the conversation together so that we're not talking about, it's not so polarized as like, it's my Second Amendment right and you can't do anything about it, period, end of story, and the other side being, we're taking the guns away. That's just the way it's going to be. How can that technology bring us together?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's this potential. We're seeing communities of NFT collectors, right, form around, right, firearms, cars,
right,
games, right. It's like it's a new technology that's facilitating bringing together, right, people with common interests, and so there's some very interesting opportunities, right, around collector's cards, around art, firearms, right? Art, firearms within games, NFT.
Oh, it's huge. I mean, the gaming community in the firearms community is massive.
Yeah. And there's this opportunity for training and advocacy groups. So training groups and advocacy groups like the NRA, Firearms Policy Coalition, Gun Owners of America, the National Shooting Sports Foundation. So, one idea with NFTs is, every time there's some kind of anti-gun legislation that comes up, and these advocacy groups need to raise funds, right, to fight these gun control initiatives. One idea that I've been talking about with the industry is, okay, if you can imagine, so let's say there's some bill, so HR 8, right, is one of these anti-gun bills. If one of these groups wanted to raise money to fight HR 8, if somebody donates $5, right, to fight to fight this legislation, they could receive an NFT, right? And just think of it as a digital patch or a coin,
like a membership card.
A membership card that authenticates your donation and support or against of this thing, whatever the stance is. Now, the other dynamic with NFTs is this concept of peacocking, as I like to call it, right? Yeah. It's like, and peacocking is everybody wants to show off their pretty NFTs, feathers.
Yeah, right? To the extent that they even use it like as their image profile, right, on their social account or something like that, right? Yeah.
Right. So, everyone wants to show off, whatever, the new gun you have, the fancy car, your house, your wedding ring, whatever.
Very human, right?
So, right, yeah, exactly. So, NFTs are the digital version of peacocking, right? That you can say, I own this thing. And I think NFTs that highlight things that you have supported is this, there's something there, right? And if you can imagine them, if you have a Pinterest type board, right, that a Pinterest type board that you can put all of your NFTs, right, to say like, oh, right, here are all the things.
Here's all the things, right? Yeah.
Like, this is a new way for advocates and advocacy groups to really show the support that exists, right, for their groups. And this extends beyond the firearms, industry and community. But I am advocating for at least this experimentation of this concept. So yeah, we'll see where that
goes. Yeah. For a lot of people are going, I still don't get it, Chris. So to that point, I really want to move this conversation from a show not tell. Right. We can talk. I can talk about this all day long. That's great. I love that.
Right.
Yeah,
and I understand how confusing this is, but the big unlock moment for me, and I think for most people, is when you see it, right? When you actually can do something with this. And back to the NBA example, man, when I saw NBA Top Shots, NFT marketplace earlier this year, I was like, I get it.
Yeah.
I get it. And it's like, it's the same thing. Like, once you shoot a gun for the first time in your life and you realize that it doesn't make you evil. Let me tell a quick personal story really quick. So let's see, this is like 2014. I'm at the Richmond Rod and Gun Club in Richmond, California, which is my home range. And I am training a new shooter. I brought a Ruger 1022, my Glock 34, competition by Salient Arms. It's like totally like super like amazing pistol.
Sounds sexy.
My Benelli M2, competition shotgun, and my competition AR-15. We're shooting all the guns, and we end with the AR, and she wanted to shoot. So I asked her ahead of time, like, hey, what kind of guns would you like me to bring for this training session? And she fires a few rounds from the AR, and like I do with most of my students, I'll, I put the gun on safe, put the gun down, and then I always ask, how did that feel? Just like, hear what the student has to say. And usually the response is, that was awesome, or that was a little scary, or sometimes it's meh, sometimes like it just, or whatever, right? For whatever reason, like they just don't like the AR-15, it's too loud or whatever. But her response to me was eye-opening because it gave me a particular insight into, I think, what is a common misperception of non-gun owners or people who haven't shot before. So she goes, wow, when I picked up the AR-15, I was expecting to feel evil. And she said, I was surprised that I was shooting the gun, that I didn't feel the urge to hurt people or to go do violent things.
Wow.
And I was like, okay. I'm like, well, now this is how, that's not how guns work.
Right.
That's not how guns work. And so, right, once you've pulled the trigger, once you've met a gay person, once you've once you've experienced, what buying an NFT is all about, it's like once you do the thing and actually like understand what it's about, is like we all, I think, learn best by doing. Yep. I mean, of course, talking about it and hearing lectures and reading, like, all important, but like once you do it or meet the subjects, right? Whether it's like Asian people, gay people, or whatever, women, all the thing, all the boxes, right? It's like, and man, like at the end of the day, like everyone, we're all just here trying to live a good life, a happy life, try and, just be happy. Like that's, I think, or maybe in my mind, that's what I would like to think.
Right.
I mean, that's the world that I want to live in.
There's a lot of distractions though, man. People can get really hung up, and I think that's the thing. People are very distracted. They don't take the time to focus on that. We mentioned the social media thing and the technology and how it can be bad versus getting outside and training, right? Like get outside and train, put the phone down or get in. Find an instructor, try new things. Yes, it might be scary. You might hate it. Okay.
I have always done things in my life that I want to do, that bring me joy, that either are just like pure entertainment, or they do some good. But I think we all have, and we've all also like faced these moments where we don't do something because we don't want to be ridiculed, or we don't want to be judged or stigmatized for whatever reason. And in the gay community, for example, right, it's like there are not a lot of gun owners, right, in the gay community. Now, don't get me wrong, there are, but there also aren't, right? And especially here in San Francisco, a lot of my gay friends are anti-gun. Now, I could have let myself be like, you know what? We're not going to be friends.
We're not going to be friends.
Right? Just be like,
there's too many differences. No, there's like one difference. You don't like guns and I do.
But I'm really thankful for my gay friends who disagree with me on all my Second Amendment gun stuff. And we're still great friends, right? Like we all, love each other as friends, that we're not going to let, a political or like policy difference, get in the way of our friendship. Right. And I guess like this all kind of, I think, reinforces a, common theme of our conversation today, which is everybody, like, we should just be doing the things that we want to do. And I mean, I know it's hard because we're all trying to live up to like either our own expectations, our family's expectations, society's expectations, right? Oh, Asian people are, supposed to be this way. Gay people are supposed to be that way. Gun owners are supposed to be this or that.
Non-gun owners are supposed to be this way, right?
Yeah. And I don't know. I just always keep on coming back to some very basic principles of be kind, be nice, be considerate, and be empathetic. And if and I hope, and others, right, can kind of just like try and have that as the center foundation for everything else, then, I don't know, like life can be a little bit more pleasurable and a little more fun. And again, it doesn't mean like you have to agree with everybody, but it also means like you don't have to get like so fired up and like offended and flying off the handle about like
it's really easy to get caught in that loop.
Yeah.
Once you're there. I mean, I think that's Chris, I could talk to you all day about this stuff. I mean, I love what you're doing. I love how you're doing it. The messaging, and it's not just because, again, I'm a firm believer in my Second Amendment rights. Again, the technology piece is fascinating. How you've gone and experimented. It's been, I don't know if the term is brave, but it's, you're doing more than a lot of people are doing. And
I like to just say it's like I don't have it's no fear.
Yeah,
I mean, it's
so if you don't know fear, you don't know bravery. It just is, right? You just go, I'm gonna go try this, right? Like I gotta.
Yeah, and I guess like I grew up in a I was gonna say I grew up in a stereotypical Asian family, but my parents actually they did not push me very hard in sort of like the tiger mom way. You might have heard like the whole like tiger mom stereotype thrown around. My parents actually gave me a lot of freedom and flexibility to do what I wanted to do. And I think they always acknowledge that like, I'm just a very strong-willed person. And the best way to motivate me to do something is to tell me I can't do it.
There's so many of us just like that.
Right.
Man.
And so my parents always sort of knew, if they just sort of need to supportive. They just need to support me, and I'm just going to like go do the things that I want to do. That bring again, all right. That's make me happy and try and do as much good out there. And the last thing I kind of wanted to make sure we talk about is earlier this week I've been part of this group called Convergence, and it's been a year-long's worth of dialogue around firearms, just the firearms culture, and at a high level, right? This Convergence nonprofit, they brought together, gun rights advocates like me, National Shooting Sports Foundation, one of my friends' nonprofits called Walk the Talk America, which is all about taking a mental health approach, right, to firearms ownership and firearms safety. But then we're also at the table with gun control groups. We also were with faith-based practitioners, mental health practitioners, the medical community, and we all came together to talk about, the whole public debate about firearms, it's all devolved into kids throwing sand at each other in the sandbox. And
it's a pretty good analogy, man.
And some of that is just, it's just, I don't want to call it necessary, but it is what it is. But is there a third way, if you will, like a different way, a different kind of conversation that we can have around reducing the amount of deaths, by firearms in our country? And so, we quickly acknowledged, right, that we have various positions on assault weapons and magazine capacity restrictions and red flag laws. And the results of our year-long discussions were just announced. The two focuses that we all agreed were areas of alignment, which are suicide prevention and mental health. Right. So many of us in the gun community, right, when there's like a mass shooting or some like terrible shooting, like all the recent ones that have happened, right, we often point to, well, if we just focus on mental health, right, and understand what are the conditions that led
how did we get here?
Yeah. Or not we, but like how did this shooter, right, get to a place where, I was gonna say he or she, it's almost always a he, right. Whole nother like interesting dynamic.
That's a whole other story. Yeah.
Right. But where did our society fail, right, from like a mental health or a community support kind of dynamic, and what can we do about it, right? Because it's unsustainable for us to continue to say, let's focus on mental health when we actually we're not doing it, right? So, in
fact, we're taking funds, we're taking things away from it. We're not putting in.
Yeah. So, back to the no fear attitude and mentality. It's like, it's not just an American thing. I think just generally in society, there is a negative stereotype around people talking about, right, they're the demons, right?
There's definitely a stigma
that we all have, right? Yep. It's like, hey, if you're going through a tough time, don't talk about it.
Especially if you're a man.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, exactly. It's like, for a lot of men, right, we are taught to not talk about our emotions if we're going through a tough time. It's like,
suck it up, dude.
Suck it up, or you bury yourself in alcohol, you bury yourself in your work.
Oh, it's all kinds of things. It's all kinds of self-destructive behaviors, man.
And for most of society, like, well, that bottling up doesn't, I don't know. Like, this is where the numbers are a little interesting, that I'm not a professional or an expert on the numbers here, but like, a percentage of people, right, who have mental health issues, are right committing crimes. Now, I also do want to like very explicitly say that just because you have mental health issues
you're a criminal.
Does not mean that you're a criminal, does not mean that you are more inclined to become a criminal.
I appreciate you saying that. Yeah. Hopefully people have gotten from this conversation that you wouldn't, but I appreciate the disclaimer.
Yeah. And so, I mean, like, crime is sort of like one slice of sort of like this mental health puzzle, if you will. And at a high level, it's how do we make sure that people who want mental health support and services, number one, can access to them. Yes. Number two, that it's affordable, whatever that means, for a particular person. But right, that money shouldn't be a barrier, right, to accessing mental health services. But then from a cultural perspective,
it also needs to be effective, man, because we've thrown a lot of shit at the wall and it's not working. Yeah. So we have to do things differently.
So yeah, I mean, right, to drill down into the mental health and suicide prevention dynamics here. So you're right, it was great to have mental health and medical professionals as part of this convergence group, because, we were talking about when you go to the doctor's office and you fill out your typical medical intake form, right? Oh, are you a smoker? Do you drink?
History of heart disease. Yeah.
Yeah, all that stuff. Well, some offices, therapists and psychiatrists, et cetera, part of the intake form is, do you own a firearm, or is a firearm in your home?
It's true. Mm-hmm.
Now, I and others, flagged that question in an intake form as extremely problematic, because, if you are going, for like mental health support, and all of a sudden you're like, why am I being asked if I have a gun? Because then the implication is, well, wait, is this therapist or medical professional now going to think that I'm here because I'm going to hurt myself?
Am I being red flagged for some reason?
Yeah, am I going to be red flagged, right? For something that's like, no, maybe you're just depressed. Doesn't mean you're like suicidal, like you're going to go out and like hurt somebody.
I have depression, and yes, I happen to own a firearm.
Right.
Those are two very different things.
So yeah, so it was interesting because, we were highlighting for the medical community, it's like, the whole idea of an intake form is to create a risk profile. And I pushed this narrative that it's lazy. It's a lazy shortcut for the medical community to create a risk profile on an intake form where it's just checking boxes like yes or no, or like scales of 1 to 5.
It's like a way to spend less time in collecting important information.
Right. So, some of the mental health specialists were saying, yeah, like sort of the quote unquote, like better way of creating that risk profile is like, they need to get to know the patient, like on an individual level.
Not in for 2 minutes and out and then prescribe a medication for depressive behavior.
Yeah. And so, right, if the question's asked around like, hey, have you ever thought of hurting yourself or other people? Now, if the answer is yes, okay, yeah, now you can start going down into like...
There's another questionnaire for that.
Yeah, but to front load a firearms-related question on a medical intake form can be very off-putting, right? And that can make people walk away.
Or withhold.
Right? Walk away from a whole mental health experience. And that's not what we want, right? And so there were a lot of great conversations around like literally like digging into the whole experience from multiple angles. And so another really memorable experience for me was these were group Zoom conversations, 15 to 20 participants every month, sometimes for 3 hours. Like these were like very long and like personal and like detailed conversations. But many of us had sidebars. Like, so I had, just like one-on-one phone calls and one-on-one, video conferences with some participants. And so I met with one of the faith-based practitioners, and she's a pastor, and she's anti-gun. And she made some comments in the group, conversations around like, she was vehemently anti-gun, and she's like, I don't want to go into like why, but she's like, anybody who wants to hear, like, let me know, and like she will
tell
it in private. And so she told me her story, and it was just horrible what she went through. So long story short, when she was a young girl, she was like 6 years old, and she had an older sister who was like 9 or 10. They were at dinner one night, and their parent, they were having some kind of family argument. Her father just angrily storms out of the room, comes back with a loaded revolver, puts it down on the table, and to his wife, he says, "You should just shoot yourself right now." And as a little kid, right? Whoa! Like, you see something like that, I mean, like, that would scare the shit out of me.
Damn that guy.
Right? Jeez. And then she had another really negative experience with firearms, where she was basically an innocent bystander in an active shooting situation. Right?
That's a tough conversation to have, man. Yeah, it's a really tough conversation to have.
And so I kind of like back to the notion of like, all of us, I think, trying to understand where people are coming from and sort of, meet them. There's this common saying of like, meet someone halfway. Yeah. I actually like the approach of, you got to meet someone where they are. Right? Meet someone where they are. And this wasn't a time, like, I'm not talking about like gun control style. I'm just like, I just want to understand.
Yeah. And just like the intake form, like put the intake form away and just, let's get caught up, catch me up.
And so, right, the interesting part about, my conversation with her is she told me, she has zero positive constructs or experience of guns and gun owners, right? It's like me and the other gun people in this group
were sort of dad. You're her dad.
Yeah, like she just sort of viscerally and emotionally is afraid of guns and gun owners, and I think for very understandable reasons. But this convergence talk was good because, right, she now has some positive, relatable people, right? It's like, okay, like now
she's maybe a little bit more open to the conversation,
and. She's a pastor, so right, she's talking to her congregation about all the societal issues, and she has
influence there too.
She's a huge influence, and I think one thing I grew up Catholic. I haven't been part of the church though in many decades, but I understand the influence, right, that faith-based practitioners have. And I guess I never really thought about how, right, gun safety and firearms education and sort of the culture community. I mean, there's an opportunity, right, for faith-based practitioners to have a voice in mental health and suicide prevention, especially in the context of, I think a lot of religions, I hate that. A lot of organized religions tend to demonize certain behaviors. I mean, of course, like, yes, if you kill someone in an unjustifiable way, like, right, that's a sin. But
taking your life is a sin.
Right. So this concept, right, suicide is selfish and it's a sin.
Period.
Hard stop. Right. Like it shuts down conversation.
Yes.
Right. And there was some interesting threads around, right, how can faith-based practitioners be positive influences on helping people, right, like surface the inner turmoil, and right, because suicide prevention and mental health, right, there's a convergence, right, which is the name of the group, right? There's this convergence of opportunity, of resources, money, right, where we can make a difference, right? If we can make a difference if we focus our time, energy, and attention on these issues in a meaningful way, instead of constantly fighting and debating what are many intractable issues in the firearms space. So I am just constantly frustrated with how disproportionately we talk about mass shootings and assault weapons bans when they account for the smallest percent of 1% of all firearms deaths.
Those are facts.
Right. So, the facts that really stood out to me about 10 years ago after I won Top Shot and I started digging into the numbers, there's about 40,000 deaths a year in America as a result of firearms. 2/3 of them are suicides. And we aren't talking about this. And it's a taboo subject. I mean, that's the other part. Like, this is the tough part. It's like talking about suicide is really uncomfortable. And if you're a gun owner and you're talking about, right, like if you have suicidal ideations, like that's even more uncomfortable. And it's right. It's sort of this like self-perpetuating mental trap that I think a lot of people get themselves into. It's like, well, right, if I talk about the fact that I'm suicidal and I own a gun, like,
red flags,
who's going to take my guns away? So practically speaking, a big part of the convergence experience was education, not legislation. Mm-hmm. And what can gun owners and non-gun owners do for people who are experiencing mental health crises? So one idea that like I hadn't really heard about, but it sounds so simple once you hear it, is as a family member or a friend, if you know someone who's going through a mental health episode and they own a firearm and you think that they're going to be a danger to themselves or others,
I see where this is going. Yeah.
You can ask if they will temporarily give them your give you their guns, or this other concept in the Denver, Colorado area in particular. There are, which is a gun-free zone, right? But there's this concept of gun ranges and gun shops that will you can basically like store your firearms there. That's a great idea. Yeah, either temporarily,
it's a service to the community,
or even on a permanent basis.
I mean,
right?
look, man. I mean, I'm looking at this as a business opportunity too. You're a gun shop. People are coming into your store to store their guns for whatever their reasons are. There's opportunity there, like, and you're servicing the community and you're helping a greater cause. I mean, there's just so many great things. But that's a brilliant idea.
Yeah, and so much I think of the discussion and the findings of this convergence group really surfaced around what are simple and obvious, but very difficult questions and conversations to have. So, here's this other idea, and I've never had to do this, right? But if you suspect, right, that someone that you know and love and care for is, right, maybe going to hurt themselves or other, you need to ask, are you thinking about hurting yourself or someone else?
That's a tough question.
That's a really hard question to ask somebody.
Maybe even a harder answer to get, right? Once you receive that answer.
Yes. Now, but so another interesting piece was, would someone who would actually say yes, would they say no? I mean, of course, yes, there's going to be some people who would lie about it, but what we were told by the mental health practitioners is that most people are honest. If they're asked that question,
they're going to be honest about it.
Yeah, which I kind of was like, okay, but
that's not your wheelhouse, but I get you a little bit, maybe a little.
And that's the whole point. It's like, I'm not a medical practitioner. I'm not in the mental health space, but these are the frontline people, right, who are out there doing the hard work, right? This is their craft. And this is sort of the magic of the convergence group, because right in the firearms space, like, I'm a firearms expert. I know firearms, I know firearms culture, but I don't know about suicide prevention or mental health stuff. But, right, where can we work together, right? So there's this group called the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. They have partnered with the NSSF, which is the National Shooting Sports Foundation, which is the industry trade group for the industry, whose members are gun shops and gun ranges and the firearms manufacturers. And so AFSP co-created suicide prevention pamphlets and content that is now in, gun stores and gun shops, right? There's conversations, right? Maybe, right, slipping in a little, quarter sheet into a gun case, right? If you buy a pistol,
or into the shopping bag or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So, like with many things, if you're armed with knowledge and you know what you could do or should do in certain situations, then you're going to be more likely to do that thing.
Right.
And the thing is, right, it's like, I mean, like I said, like I've not had any suicide prevention training. Like I never had any conversations with my family or friends. Like what do you do if someone is suicidal that you care about?
Yeah. So you ask the question, now what?
Exactly. Right? Yeah. Asking the question, or even seeing and understanding some of the signs.
Right.
I mean, and this kind of goes back to the notion of, how can we be better at taking care of not just ourselves, but right, our friends and our family and people we care about, and not just picking up on those signs, but like what's the action, what's the plan, what are your options? Suicide prevention hotline, phone number, text message groups that are out there too. But I'm excited for the convergence, findings. We just announced it, and now the hard work begins, right? This is like,
now we take action.
Yeah, and to be frank, you would think that the notion of saving lives would be a universal
top of priority list.
Yeah, thing, but there are some people who just either don't care, are skeptical of all of this, and
well, I imagine if it doesn't suit their political agenda and or their financial agenda, it's probably not important for them either.
Yeah, and
that's ridiculous. We're talking about saving people's lives on the.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be an ongoing conversation, and there's this initiative called Project 2025 that's put on by the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, where they are aiming to reduce the suicide rate by 20%. By 2025. So that's a very clear objective goal that we're trying to reach. And this is literally one of these things that the government's not going to do it for us. Other people aren't going to do it for us. We have to do this for us. So it's going to be hopefully, a large educational campaign that's going to be sustained, hopefully, right? Over many, many years. And yeah, I mean, thank you for having me on, because, this is something that I think is going to be meaningful. That's going to make a difference, right? And if we really if anybody really, really, really cares about reducing firearms deaths, we have to be addressing the suicide part as much as we're focusing on reducing homicides as well.
Right. If you want to move the needle, you're going to have to do things differently, right? Can't keep beating your head against the wall and expect a different result. It's just going to keep hurting. Oh, man. Chris, I mean, again, I'm so grateful to have you down here. The conversation, some of the insight to some things, there's been so much there. Again, what you're doing and how you're doing it is inspiring.
Well, thank you.
I'm bought into the prospect of going to the next step on the NFT side of things. I thought I was before I came in, and you've confirmed that. And, today, and I just want to thank you for sharing the insight to the things that are happening that people haven't heard about yet, on the back end, that there are people getting together at a larger level that are trying to bridge these gaps. And hopefully that inspires people within the gun community and outside the gun community to think differently about doing the same, and be on the lookout, just because you've made them now aware of those types of things. And again, bringing that higher level awareness then can bring some education, and then can bring community. And like you said, once you have a community like that, then people can be happier and healthier and let people do what they need and want to do. Man, thanks again. I appreciate you being here, bud.
Appreciate it. I had a great time, and let's see where the future takes us.
Last thing I'd ask, if people want to find out a little bit more about you, a little bit more of the initiatives that you're a part of, the projects that you're working on, maybe contribute to those projects in some way, what is the best way for people to find out more and or get in touch with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a website, topshotchris.com. My contact information's up on my website. And then on social media, my handle's at topshotchris on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and also Medium.com, which is where I've been writing a lot about NFTs. So if you're particularly interested in hearing more about my NFT journey, Medium is the place where I'm publishing most of my writing about NFTs. So it's a good time.
Right on. That'll be on the regular daily read for me. I appreciate you, bud. Thanks again for coming down. Hope to visit with you real soon.
Awesome. Thanks again.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Iron Sights. If you enjoyed our conversation, you can support our mission by hitting the subscribe button, leaving a review, and sharing the podcast with a friend. I'll see you on the next episode.